In the shadowed corridors of Roman history, one name whispers louder than all others: Caligula. A ruler whose madness redefined tyranny, whose cruelty outpaced even Rome's blood-soaked standards, and whose memory was so reviled that his statues were smashed and his name struck from records. Yet try as they might, the Romans could not erase what they had endured. For Caligula was more than a madman. He was a mirror, showing the empire what it could become when power was left unchecked. His story, buried in shame, lives on. Not as a tale of the past, but a warning to the future. The making of a monster asterisk. He was born into power, but bathed in blood long before he wore the crown, in 12 AD. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, later known as Caligula, toured a world where affection was a political liability. Survival was earned through silence. The Roman Empire, outwardly grand, was a palace of shifting shadows. Every corridor echoed with whispers of poison, betrayal, and executions staged as acts of justice. Caligula's childhood unfolded beneath the banners of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the most dangerous family in the world. His great-grandfather was Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, hailed as a god by some, remembered by others as a smiling tyrant. His grandfather, Tiberius, was a man of fear and paranoia, who saw threats in every glance. And then there was Caligula's father, Germanicus, a rare jewel in a field of serpents. Beloved by the people, adored by the legions, he was a star too bright for Rome. He died young, likely poisoned under imperial orders. Leaving behind a legacy his son would twist beyond recognition. As a boy, Caligula marched with the army along the Rhine. Soldiers dressed him in miniature armor and nicknamed him Caligula, Little Boot. He smiled for them, laughed with them, and learned something no child should. Power is performance, and adoration can be bought with blood. The soldiers who once played with him would be the first to die in the games he later orchestrated. Loss defined his youth. His mother, Agrippina, the elder, outspoken and proud, was exiled and starved to death. His brothers Nero and Drusus were imprisoned and murdered, one choked on his own vomit, the other wasted into a skeleton in chains. The message to Caligula was clear: family is not sanctuary, love is not protection, it's the only way to survive in. Rome was to pretend to be harmless, charming, even stupid. He wore a mask so convincing that Tiberius, old and rotting on the Isle of Capri, kept him close, amused by what he believed to be a harmless boy. But Caligula was not harmless. He was watching. He was learning. He was waiting. Tiberius, in his final years, grew obsessed with omens and dreams. He feared death, yet feared more what would follow him. Caligula fed the old man's illusions, played the dutiful ward, and ensured that when the emperor died, the only heir remaining would be himself. Some say Caligula smothered Tiberius with his own hands. Others say he merely smiled while it happened. History doesn't agree, but it doesn't matter. The viper had outlived its master. At just 24 years old, Caligula became emperor of Rome. The Senate rejoiced. The people wept with joy. After years of Tiberian gloom, they believed a golden age was beginning. They were wrong. The boy who had once worn little boots would soon wear the skin of a god, but first he would shed everything human inside him. For a brief moment, Rome believed the nightmare was over. Instead, it had just begun to dream with its eyes open. When Caligula first ascended the throne in 37 AD, it was not as a tyrant, but as a savior. The people called him our star reborn. After the long, joyless reign of Tiberius, marked by fear, exile, and silence, Rome erupted into celebration. Statues of Caligula were kissed in the streets. Prisoners were freed. Exiles returned. It was as if winter had ended and a new spring was at hand. He gave generously. Massive bonuses flowed to the Praetorian Guard, the urban cohorts, and even the fire brigades. Senators received invitations instead of subpoenas. The imperial treasury, once hoarded by Tiberius, was thrown open like a public fountain. Gladiatorial games dazzled the masses with exotic beasts and gold-stained arenas. Chariot races, feasts, and festivals erupted across the empire. His face, young and handsome, beamed from coins and temple murals. Rome adored him. How could it not? He walked among the people, dressed not in armor or finery, but in white, barefoot, humble. He claimed no divine status, not yet. His words were soft, his smile sincere. He visited temples and spoke of the gods with reverence. He wept at his father's grave. He kissed the hands of veterans. He bowed to his mother's memory, and the people bowed back. But beneath the silk of his public persona, something stirred. His laughter during the games lingered too long. His eyes traced the flow of blood in the sand. When gladiators died, his gaze didn't turn away, sharpened. The crowd cheered. He watched them more than the battle. He was learning what they truly wanted. Not justice. Not virtue. Spectacle. Even so, the illusion held for a time. Foreign ambassadors returned home, praising his intellect. Theaters reopened, public works began. The unfinished monuments of Tiberius were completed. A new amphitheater rose. Jobs multiplied. Rome had not seen such activity since Augustus. But there were whispers. Palace servants spoke of late-night wanderings through the blood-stained arena floors, of solitary laughter echoing in empty colosseums, of the emperor asking no one in particular, "Wasn't it beautiful?" And then answering himself, "It will be more beautiful tomorrow." His nights were sleepless, his dreams violent, his days filled with unpredictable silence. He stared too long, smiled too rarely, and when he did, it was never with his eyes. 8 months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. The city held its breath. Temples overflowed with prayers. Citizens vowed to sacrifice their own lives for his recovery. The Senate fasted, the people cried in the streets, and then he recovered. The empire exhaled in relief. But what emerged from his bed was not the same man who had entered it. Something in him had burned away, melted under fever. Compassion, restraint, doubts, these things were gone. His voice now grated, his gaze pierced. He claimed Jupiter had spoken to him in the dark, that he had walked among the stars, that he had seen his own divinity. And Rome, still clinging to hope, still drunk on spectacle, still blinded by gold, did not yet see the monster behind the light. Rome prayed for his recovery, the gods answered. But what they returned was no longer a man. 8 months into his reign, Caligula was struck down by a sudden and violent illness. Ancient sources describe fever, convulsions, delirium. Some believe it was encephalitis, others epilepsy, or perhaps something darker, something spiritual. Whatever it was, it dragged him to the edge of death, and then left him twisted on the other side. Rome froze. The man they had worshipped like a god now lay dying in his bed, moaning in tongues, eyes rolling back in his skull.
Outside the palace,
crowds gathered. Citizens vowed to offer their own lives to the gods if the emperor survived. Senators wept publicly. Altars overflowed with sacrifices. It was hysteria love fused with fear, and then he lived. But the man who emerged from his sickbed was not the same one who had entered it. His voice now rasped like a broken instrument. His movements became sharp, unpredictable. His eyes no longer looked at people, they looked through them. He began speaking of divine voices, claiming that Jupiter spoke to him directly, that he had glimpsed the underworld, that he had seen his soul on fire. From that moment, Caligula no longer believed he ruled Rome. He believed he was Rome. He began to test the boundaries between man and God. He declared his sister Drusilla divine heaven while she still lived, called her Venus incarnate, and forced her to share his bed, treating her as both wife and deity. When she died, suddenly possibly poisoned, possibly from childbirth, Caligula lost all restraint. He declared a national mourning. It became illegal to smile, to bathe, to dine with family. Anyone caught breaking mourning rituals was executed. Laughing became treason. He would wander the palace in silence, whispering to statues, waiting for them to respond. He held midnight rituals in which he claimed to commune with the gods, sacrificing animals, chanting, sometimes disappearing for days. Servants reported hearing him scream into mirrors, asking, "Who am I now?" He stopped calling himself emperor, began calling himself God. His cruelty, once casual, became calculated. He ordered executions not in anger, but in amusement. He would invite senators to dinner and describe how their wives might die. He forced noble families to attend public torture sessions as spectators. He reportedly told one man, "Your death is not a punishment, it's my art." Caligula became obsessed with dreams. If someone appeared in his sleep and displeased him even as a shadow, he would have them arrested. One senator was executed because the emperor claimed he smiled incorrectly in a vision. Fear spread like fire. The palace became a place where even a gesture could mean death. Guards flinched at his footsteps. Courtiers trained themselves to laugh, cry, or kneel on command. And still Rome clapped, because the games continued, because gold still flowed. Because fear had become indistinguishable from loyalty. The illness did not kill him. It unlocked him. What followed was no longer a reign. It was a descent. When a man calls himself a god, you laugh. When an empire bows to him, the laughter dies. After his illness, Caligula no longer wore the mask of modesty. He tore it off and replaced it with a crown not of gold, but of divinity. In his eyes, he was no longer Caesar. He was Jupiter reborn, Neptune on earth, Venus in flesh. He was everything, and demanded to be treated as such. The Senate was the first to feel the shift. No longer an institution of power, it became a theater of humiliation. Caligula would enter draped in shimmering robes, sometimes bare-chested like a demigod, other times adorned with a fake beard and thunderbolt, mocking Jupiter. On some days, he appeared as Venus's face powdered, lips painted, wearing silken gowns, daring anyone to look away. Senators were forced to crawl to him on hands and knees, kiss his feet, and address him not as princeps, but as divine Lord. Those who hesitated, paused, flinched, or failed to smile fast enough were dragged from the chamber and never seen again. Their estates seized, families shamed. He installed his own statue inside temples across the empire, replacing the heads of ancient gods with his own likeness. In Judea, riots broke out at the suggestion of placing Caligula's image in the Jerusalem temple. He laughed at the outrage. "If they will not worship me," he said, "I will make them." Sacrifices were offered in his name. Citizens who failed to appear enthusiastic enough during these blasphemous ceremonies were arrested. Worship was no longer sacred, it was mandatory. Faith became surveillance. But it was not just gods he mocked, it was men. He appointed his horse Tacitus as consul. The creature lived in a marble stable, dined from ivory troughs, and was guarded by soldiers. Some say this was madness. Others say it was satire. Caligula, showing the Senate that a beast could govern better than they. And perhaps he was right. His divine mania spread beyond temples and courts. At banquets, he demanded spontaneous hymns be sung in his honor. He declared the moon his mistress, and once attempted to marry it in a midnight ritual witnessed only by terrified slaves, he claimed. Thunder was applause from the gods. When storms struck Rome, he would raise his arms to the sky and scream, "You are not louder than me." He declared war on Neptune. Along the shores of Gaul, he assembled his legions, ordered them to stab the sea and collect seashells as spoils of war. These trophies were shipped back to Rome in golden chests, paraded through the streets while Caligula stood atop a chariot, basking in imaginary triumph. And through it all, Rome watched. Some laughed behind closed doors, others wept. Most remained silent, because silence under Caligula was survival. What began as delusion became policy. What began as theater became law. Rome had once conquered gods with steel and fire. Now, it bowed to a man who declared himself immortal and dared the heavens to prove him wrong. Power corrupted him, but pleasure destroyed what little was left. Behind the marble columns and golden drapes of the imperial palace, Rome's darkest secrets were not whispered, they were screamed. Caligula's court became a sanctum of excess, where sex, torture, and humiliation were blended into one grotesque theater of control. No guest, no senator, no noble was safe. The line between privilege and punishment no longer existed. It was erased. It was painted over with wine, blood, and tears. His nights were filled with banquets, but they were no feasts of joy. They were stages of degradation. Guests were invited not to dine but to perform. He would sit in a high-backed throne, surrounded by flickering oil lamps and masked attendants, watching as senators and their wives were ordered to strip, copulate, or beg. Sometimes he chose participants himself, other times he pointed at random. To refuse was death. To obey was worse. He began publicly raiding women's bodies, comparing them to prostitutes he kept in a gilded chamber below the palace. He summoned married women, violated them while their husbands stood nearby, then returned to the table and described the act in chilling, clinical detail, smiling, laughing, watching the room twist in silent agony. Sex for Caligula was not about desire. It was domination, control, a way to break people without touching their bones. And then there were the children. Ancient accounts speak in half-tones, horrified hints, broken phrases. Girls barely past childhood, boys no older than slaves. Took them, displayed them, used them, then discarded them like broken toys. Parents, silenced by terror, were forced to watch and thank him. Their gratitude was mandatory, their heartbreak invisible. He turned the palace into a brothel, one not for the poor, but for the elite. Wives of senators were made to serve foreign dignitaries. Daughters of nobles were auctioned as divine entertainment. Even his sisters Julia Livilla, Agrippina the Younger were not spared. He fondled them at banquets, boasted of incest, and forced them to be gifts to ambassadors. Family, like virtue, was a fiction he enjoyed destroying. But it didn't end with sex. It never did. His cruelty demanded performance. Men were whipped to death in public. Women were tied to pillars and raped before execution. Guards learned to make an art of pain. Screams echoed through the corridors, not as cries but as music. He developed rituals, ceremonies, where his acts of violence became sacred. He declared his phallus holy, forced worship, called it communion, ordered priests to kneel before him. He believed pain purified others and elevated him. The amphitheater, once the pride of Roman architecture, became an extension of his madness. Gladiators were replaced by nobles, combat by sexual humiliation. Some were forced to fight naked, others raped before being fed to animals. And when the criminals ran low, he turned to the crowd. He pointed, he chose, he destroyed. It was no longer government. It was no longer rule. It was a horror cult with a throne at its center. And at that center sat a man unlaughing, watching, feeding off the ruin of human dignity. Rome once ruled the world with legions and law. Under Caligula, it ruled with a horse, a joke, to scream. The imperial throne had become a stagined Caligula, its deranged playwright. He no longer sought to govern, he sought to mock. Secret, but in plain sight. His empire was not a republic, nor a monarchy, nor a dictatorship. It was a performance where cruelty was comedy, institutions were props, and everyone in Rome was cast in a tragedy that masqueraded as farce. The Roman economy, built over centuries on conquest, trade, and discipline, collapsed under the weight of his ego. The vast treasury left by Tiberius was gone within a year, spent on chariot races, orgies, palaces, golden statues, and seashells. Yes, seashells. Caligula. In a display of divine madness, declared war on the god Neptune. He marched his legions to the shores of Gaul, ordered them to stab the sea, then collect shells as spoils of victory. These trophies were paraded through Rome in a triumphal procession. Citizens stood in stunned silence as soldiers carried crates of wet shells draped in gold silk, while the emperor rode high in his chariot, cloaked in Alexander the Great's breastplate, declaring the conquest of the ocean, He taxed everything. Marriages, divorces, lawsuits, prostitution, gambling, even silence during his speeches. Those who failed to cheer or yawned at the wrong moment were fined or executed. He introduced a tax on breathing in his presence. Those who sneezed without permission were dragged away. When money ran out, he turned to treason trials, not for justice, but for wealth. He accused rich men of imaginary crimes, had them executed, then seized their estates. Their wives were forced to thank him for liberating their households from unfaithful husbands. The Senate, already broken, became a circus. One day, Caligula burst into the chamber, laughing, announcing that he had promoted his horse Tacitus. To consul, the animal was brought in wearing a purple sash, escorted by guards, and given oats mixed with gold. Senators stood and clapped. They had no choice. The joke was not on the horse. It was on them. The military fared no better. He humiliated commanders, forced centurions to run alongside his chariot like dogs. Veteran officers were made to crawl through mud while he pelted them with dates. His generals, once respected warriors, became clowns in his private theater of absurdity. He issued contradictory orders in the middle of battle exercises, declared victories without fighting wars. Once, he halted an entire legion for hours too. Received divine orders from the moon? When asked later why he changed plans, he replied, because the moon changed her mind. Rome was no longer led. It was mocked. The people laughed nervously. The elites wept quietly. The soldiers obeyed blindly. Caligula watched it all unfold with the eyes of a man who believed he was immortal, untouchable, and hilarious. But behind every joke lay a corpse. The economy rotted, morale plummeted, fear replaced faith. And still he smiled because in his mind, the laughter of Rome was real, and if it wasn't, he would force it. Gods do not bleed, but Caligula did. And the first cut came not from a blade but from humiliation. By the year 41 AD, Rome was drowning in madness, but it was no longer silent. Whispers echoed behind velvet curtains, among the Senate's ash-faced elders, and deep within the ranks of the Praetorian Guard, fear was still present, but now it had company. Hatred. Even Caligula's closest guards. Those who had once sworn to protect him with their lives had begun to see what he truly was. Not a god, not a ruler, but a disease. One that fed on Rome's dignity, its sons, its memory. Cassius Dio was no hero, a senior centurion in the Praetorian Guard. He had served under emperors for decades. But Caligula despised him, mocked him, forced him to use demeaning passwords. Like Priapus and Venus, laughed at his voice, spit on his rank. It wasn't politics that turned Sharia against Caligula. It was personal, but he was not alone. The conspiracy grew in secret within the Senate, among freedmen in the ranks of the Guard. Each had suffered, lost family, lost honor, lost sleep. What united them wasn't ambition. It was survival. They knew that under Caligula, no one was safe, not children, not generals, not gods. And so, they planned. The moment would come during the Palatine Games, an event Caligula had designed to glorify himself through theatrical violence and divine imagery. The irony was almost poetic. He would be surrounded by symbols of immortality on the very day. His mortality was exposed. They chose the underground corridor beneath the Palisa. Narrow passage, where Caligula often passed alone, away from his Germanic bodyguards. A place dark, stone-lined, and echoing with ancient silence. January 24th. Midday Caligula watched the morning's performances, mock battles, divine reenactments, actors portraying assassinated emperors. He laughed, he cheered. He leaned over to whisper vulgar jokes to his sister's former husband. He was in good spirits. He was unguarded. When he rose to return to the palace for lunch, he took the shortcut. As planned, Cassius Dio was waiting. No one shouted. No one warned. The first blow struck his jawbone, cracked, blood sprayed across. Limestone, then a second, then dozens. He screamed not as a god, but as a man. A terrified, broken man, Suetonius wrote that 30 wounds pierced his body. Some by sword, some by dagger, some by bare hands. His final words, if they were real, chilled history, "I am still alive." But he wasn't. His body was left in a heap, robes torn, divine laurel trampled beneath sandals. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with the dust of Rome's oldest stones. The man who called himself immortal died alone, unwept, unmourned. But the nightmare wasn't over. The Senate panicked. Would the German bodyguards retaliate? Would the people revolt? There was no clear successor. Civil war loomed. Chaos rippled. Through the heart of Rome, then, in a twist of fortune, a nervous clerk pulled back a curtain and found Claudius Caligula's uncle trembling behind it, weeping. He would be emperor by sunset, and Rome would breathe again. He died not as a god, not as a king, not even as a man, but as a warning carved in blood and silence. Caligula's death sent a tremor through Rome, but not the kind he would have expected. There was no national mourning, no temples weeping, no people prostrating themselves in grief. There was only silence, the eerie kind that follows a storm so violent, even the earth forgets how to breathe. The Senate did not rejoice. It panicked. What would happen now? Would his Germanic guards retaliate? Would the gods curse the city for striking down their chosen son? Was Rome freed or merely exposed? For hours, chaos gripped the city. Factions formed, plots collided. Fires broke out near the palace. But amid the confusion, one man emerged, trembling, stammering, hidden behind a curtain. Claudius, the uncle. No one expected. The man Caligula had mocked for his stutter, his limp, his books. And yet it was Claudius whom the Praetorian Guard raised on their shields and declared emperor. Not out of love, not even out of trust, but because Rome needed order, and Claudius had survived long enough to claim it. His first act? To erase Caligula? The Senate declared a damnatio memoria, formal condemnation of memory. Statues were pulled down, inscriptions defaced, coins melted, public records altered. It became illegal to speak his name aloud, but memory does not obey law. The people remembered. The scars were too deep. For 4 years, they had lived inside a nightmare stitched together by fear, blood, and forced applause. Families had vanished. Temples had been defiled. Children had been broken in the name of divine pleasure. They could not forget, and neither could history. Writers like Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio recorded what they could have, in horror, half in awe. They debated whether Caligula had gone mad from illness or had simply been born hollow. Some blamed epilepsy, but others divine punishment. Others still, absolute power, the kind that strips away the skin of civility and reveals the beast beneath. But none of them could deny the truth. Rome had allowed it. Rome had applauded it. Rome had called him God. What followed his reign was not a return to peace, but a deeper understanding of how fragile civilization truly was. The Senate was never the same. The people never again believed fully in the divinity of emperors. The gods grew quiet. The stones of Rome felt colder, and in dark corners poets whispered, "If it happened once, it can happen again." Caligula's reign did not end with his death. It lived on in fear, in silence. In the collective guilt of a city that had bowed to Icily, he tried to become a god. In the end, he became something far more enduring, a lesson,